Good evening, welcome to Center Place, and welcome to our History, Theology, and Philosophy lecture series. This is, as always, a live interactive presentation. Mike is here as our producer, and he's going to be watching your comments in the stream on Facebook and on YouTube, and so he'll give those to me at the end, and so after the formal lecture, we will have a Q&A section. You can view our entire catalog of lectures. They're on an amazing number of topics at this point. There's over 150 of them at centerplace.ca/lectures, and we always invite you to go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's just an amazing amount of content there, and you'll be notified by YouTube as a subscriber as we post things. I'm going to mention some of our upcoming lectures. Next Tuesday, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Thomas and the Lost Sayings Gospel Q. So both of these Gospels, Q is hypothetical and it's lost and not found. Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, had been lost but was found in the middle of the 20th century in the desert of Egypt in Akamadi, where it was dug up. And a Coptic version or Egyptian version of the Greek original exists, and there are some fragments also that have been found of the Greek. And both of these are Gospels that don't really have a lot of narrative elements telling about the, let's say, life or ministry of Jesus or anything like that, but instead focus on sayings of Jesus. And so when Thomas was first discovered or rediscovered, a lot of people asked, well, wait a second, is it possible that they've now actually found this hypothetical lost source sayings Gospel Q, this thing that scholars have determined almost certainly had to exist in order to explain the overlap in the literary dependency in between Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In other words, the idea that the authors of Matthew and Luke had an additional source that has been lost that they shared in order to craft their Gospels independently of one another. Anyway, so what we're going to look at next week is how close are the sayings in Thomas and Q. So it'll be kind of interesting, I think. Our lectures are, as always, remind you, are listener supported. We really appreciate the contributions that people have been making and continue to make. You can always do that at our website, centerplace.ca/donate. Our topic tonight are matriarchs versus patriarchs in the Bible. So, a lot of, we know just from ancient times in general, times were, let's say, more sexist in the past than they are even today at present. And certainly, unfortunately, in terms of some of the cultures that we have the greatest inheritance from in terms of the Western tradition, Roman culture, Greek culture, and also Middle Eastern cultures, Jewish culture, all are kind of, maybe, let's say, of ancient cultures, maybe even more sexist or patriarchal than some of their contemporary societies. And so anyway, as a result of that, that has had a major effects because of the thought that each of those societies give us, both Roman society for law, Greek society for philosophy, and Hebrew Jewish culture for religion in the West. And as a result, that has had a bunch of layers and effects and negative effects for the role of women, gender roles in Western society that have had to be overcome in the last century or more. And I want to look at that. But on the other hand, despite the fact that that exists, it does turn out that when we go back to the very earliest books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, and so on, it turns out that there are a lot of very powerful female characters in the text in ways that might not be something we would expect given our, let's say, stereotype about sexism in ancient societies and so forth. So in terms of their chronological setting, the earliest stories in the Bible take place in a time called the Age of Patriarchs, the Age of the Patriarchs. This is this time period from Adam through Noah, and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and so forth, the sons of Israel, leading down to Moses in the Exodus story. The word patriarch that we have is a Greek word. You can always see ark there for, leader and so on. So we have all of our different words that are like that, from everything from anarchy, which means like no leader, to all the other words that we have that that have rule by so and so, an archon, a leader. Whereas patri here is father, so it means rule by the fathers. And so the stories in Genesis are told about an extended family rather than a whole people, as in Exodus. So this story of Abraham more or less seems to follow a single Bedouin family, which has not yet emerged as an entire nation. Essentially, in the beginning of the Bible, the transition really happens during the time period when the children of Israel are living in Egypt. So Joseph is sold as a slave in Egypt. He rises to being the vizier of the Pharaoh, and once he is rich and well established and so forth, he invites his brothers and family to live with him. They continue to be there until they outpopulate the Egyptians, whereupon Pharaoh decides to enslave the Hebrew nation that is there, and that's setting up the beginning of the story for Exodus. So essentially it's a family up until that kind of time period between Joseph and Moses, when it becomes a nation, in the story anyway. So the stories in Genesis, nevertheless, also, though, portray Abraham, even if he's just, let's say, a guy as opposed to the king of a whole people at that time, he's nevertheless treated as a peer of kings. And so there's a really odd story preserved in Genesis chapter 14, where Abraham interacts with a whole bunch of kings. There's a king of Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboam, and also the king of Salem. There's a bunch of strange things that kind of happen, including ultimately Abraham giving tithes to this king called Melchizedek, which just in Hebrew means righteous king, the king of Salem. It's hard to describe, or otherwise not appearing in this story, or to explain who he is, kind of a character. And that component story is one of those, let's say, kernels that is in the biblical text that seems to be preserving an older story that the authors are taking from some previous source, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But in any event, Abraham is sort of, like I say, seen as kind of like a peer of kings, because he's written in this sort of heroic or legendary age of founders, where essentially everybody who is living in the heroic age, and sort of like the age that in Greek mythology, the age that takes place before the Trojan War, so the age when the different people are founding the city of Thebes or Athens, or any of the other kinds of stories of foundation that takes place in the heroic age in Greek mythology. So nevertheless, the biblical stories focus on Abraham's difficulty in producing any sons at all, much less the whole future nations that God has promised. So God has promised that he will have descendants that are more plentiful than the stars in the sky, the sand in the sea, and yet he struggles a lot to actually have any kids at all in the story. Another thing that happens in these stories is that the patriarchs interact directly with God, as opposed to the much more indirect way that things happen with the later biblical prophets, who, for example, the prophets are seeing God not in a hailstorm or in a bellowing voice or anything like that, but in the still small voice of silence and so forth. Or later prophets still, by the time we get to the Second Temple period, where now the apocalyptic prophets are essentially talking about visions by interacting with angels. So an angel will come and share a vision or a dream with a prophet, and that's how Revelation is seen. It's much more direct in these stories of the patriarchs. And so Adam is walking around in the garden, or God is walking around in the garden with Adam. Jacob in Genesis 32 is wrestling. It's become in the story, it seemingly is he's wrestling with an angel, but it does seem to be preserving an earlier story where he may have been wrestling directly with God, because when he's done wrestling, he says, "I've seen God face to face," and his name is changed from Jacob to Israel, which means wrestling with God rather than wrestling with an angel. And so there's a really direct connection anyway in this narrative stories. And indeed, the God's self is actually referred to as, the God of Israel, which on the one hand means the people, since Jacob is the eponymous or namesake ancestor for the nation of Israel. But it's also the God of Jacob, in other words, that person. And so God is called the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. In other words, because of this direct connection that God has with these patriarchs. So, despite telling, though, this of a patriarchal age, these stories in Genesis and Exodus actually include a surprising number of strong women. Surprising to me anyway, it was when I sort of read it and have reread Genesis and Exodus. The patriarch Isaac, for example, stands out as particularly passive, I think, in the stories. Abraham runs around and does clever or some cases problematic things, deceiving Pharaoh and deceiving other kings and so forth, tricking them. But Isaac doesn't have a lot of things that he does that are pretty noteworthy. He's mostly, the stories that we know of Isaac especially are the story of him almost getting sacrificed by Abraham. So Abraham, having had all this trouble having a son, is told by God to go and sacrifice this son by Sarah, Isaac, and he goes and Isaac is asking, well, where's the ram? How are we going to do a sacrifice? And he's going to actually sacrifice Isaac up until the last minute when Abraham is stopped, right? So Isaac is going to be the sacrificial victim. And then later, the other story that he's pretty well known for is being deceived by his wife, Rebekah. He has this favorite son, Esau, that he would want to give his blessing to. Esau's twin brother, slightly seconds younger brother, Jacob, is Rebekah's favorite. And so she tricks Isaac into giving the blessing to the wrong son, to her favorite. Let's read that briefly in Genesis 27. Now, Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. He said to his son Esau, "Hey, go hunt, bring back the meat that I like so much, and then I'm going to give you a blessing, my blessing." So when Esau went to the field to hunt game for his father, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me game and prepare me savory food to eat, that I might bless you before the Lord before I die.' Now," she says to Jacob, "Now therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock, get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare them savory food for your father, such as he likes, and you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." And Jacob says to his mother, "Look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a man of smooth skin. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing." So Isaac is blind, and so he's able to, or short of sight or whatever at this point, and so they want a way to trick him. So his mother says, "Let your curse be on me, my son, only obey my word and go get them for me." So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and the mother prepared the savory food, such as the father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and she put them on her younger son Jacob. Then she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck, and then she handed the savory food and the bread that she'd prepared for her to her son Jacob. And so then, after successfully tricking Isaac and cheating Esau, Rebekah helps Jacob flee, telling him, "Your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, hear my voice, obey my voice. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran and so forth. And so pretty much this entire plot, you can kind of see, is entirely hatched by Rebekah. Rebekah tells Jacob what to do. Jacob is not coming up with these ideas himself. She's the one that is doing the tricking, and she actually also plans his escape and so forth. So while Rebekah, like I say, comes off as especially active and successful in contrast to Isaac, she's not alone among these stories. So Genesis and Exodus contain a large number of these strong female characters, as we will see. So this is my kind of shorthand list that I've created of significant women in Genesis and Exodus. So we had Rebekah here, as we already mentioned, but if we go back in the story earlier, there's also Eve, Sarai or Sarah, the wife of Abraham, Sarah's handmaiden and the concubine of Abraham, Hagar, Abraham's nephew, Lot's wife, and Lot's daughters. They're actually not named, but in any event, they have activities that are interesting. Rebekah, as we just mentioned. Then when Rebekah sends Jacob off to her brother Laban's house, Jacob ends up marrying Laban's two daughters, Leah and Rachel, who are interesting characters in their own right. Jacob's daughter by Leah is named Dinah. Then there's also a story of Tamar that we'll talk about. And then in addition, once we get to Joseph in Egypt, Joseph is seduced by, or has an attempted seduction by Potiphar's wife. And then after the generations of the Israelites being in Egypt, when Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh, decides to kill all the Israelite boys, and Moses is put into the little raft to save him, the little ark, he's rescued from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter. And then finally, Moses' wife, Zipporah, is another interesting character in her own right. Okay, so whenever we're going to look at ancient literature like the Bible, there's a bunch of things we have to be thinking about in order to read it in context. So in addition to being scripture for Judaism and Christianity, the Hebrew Bible, Christian Old Testament, is a collection of ancient texts that together have had a massive literary and cultural impact. And obviously, in order to understand the historical context, it's more important to understand the context of the author than it is to be trying to think about the context of the time period when their characters are set. So, for example, for biblical stories, people often ignore the author's context. In other words, when was this text being written? What time period was that? What is that like? And instead, they would like to focus on the, what I'm going to say, imagined historical context of the characters. And generally speaking, in most cases in Genesis and Exodus, for example, there is no dates at all given in this. And so people have done various means of trying to add up numbers that don't actually properly add up in the Bible in order to try to assert a year when it should have happened and so forth. This is an entirely artificial and modern overlaying distortion of the text, and it ends up finding a false context. In other words, the context of an imagined setting as opposed to the context of the author itself, which is what the author knows about. So, for example, in the case of the story of Sarah and Abraham, people often want to say, well, what were things like when they would have been alive? Maybe, let's say, if that was 2000 BCE or so. In a way, that's not particularly relevant because that is not when the story was composed. The story is composed much more recently, so maybe at its earliest in the 7th century, but possibly 6th century or even the 5th century before the Common Era. So in other words, way more than 1,000 years after it's set. And the ancient author who composed the story was not a historian. He's pretty much writing before the invention of history, would not have known much about that earlier era that occurred 1,400 years earlier. And so, like I say, understanding the story actually requires us to look at the actual author's context. it is sometimes possible when there's an oral tradition, for example, as we have with the, let's say, the Iliad and the Odyssey, there is a composition can take place earlier than the written text. So there's a difference between when an oral composition happens and when the story is actually written down. But in a lot of cases that requires, for that to actually transmit without writing, that requires a kind of, let's say, oral tradition where you have a kind of a poetry that a bard-like class or something like that, a class of storyteller or like Homer or Bard, a person who's singing these kinds of stories would have to be able to memorize them and use them, and or use those stories are also not fixed because the oral tradition includes, let's say, poetic devices that allow it to be kind of recomposed and retold in different ways with each telling and so forth. And so as a result of that, some of the, let's say, the earliest texts of Zoroastrianism, are much older than when they were first written, and we can sort of tell that because there is an archaic language and poetry in which they are composed that people are memorizing and just repeating even when they don't even know what it means anymore. That is not happening with these stories. So these are not written. There are components in here of poems that are within the stories that are the oldest things, like the Song of Moses, the Song of Miriam, and so forth. There are ancient nuggets within the biblical text, but in general, this is not written that way. And it's a literary source that is written much later than it's set. Okay, so who are the authors then of the earliest books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, and so forth? So the other books of the Bible, the prophetic books, for example, claim authors that can generally be fit into historical chronology. So if we're looking at the book of Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, these are claiming at the beginnings of the text anyway that there is a historical prophet named Isaiah who is the source of some of that early text, specifically probably the early parts of the poetic writing. In the book of Isaiah's case, there are later continuers that add on, and so some of the text as we have it now is written hundreds of years after Isaiah died and so forth. Nevertheless, we have a sense of who the historical Isaiah would have been and when the historical Isaiah would have been around. There are claimed authorship for some of the, for example, Psalms, which are ascribed to David. So the Psalms claim anyway that King David wrote them. Those are not likely to be the case in any case. And certainly there's a number of wisdom books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which claim that Solomon is their author, and those are definitely not written by Solomon. And indeed, Solomon is not a historical figure, probably. Or to the extent that Solomon existed, all we would have known is that there's a legend attached to Solomon that maybe the Jerusalem temple was built by a king named Solomon, but all of the other stories will have been a literary creation later. So the authors, though, of the historical books, so that would mean the first 5 books attributed to Moses, and then all of the later books that we sometimes call the Deuteronomic histories, so Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and so forth. Those are largely anonymous. And so even though tradition assigns the first 5 of those to Moses, tradition assigns some of the later ones maybe to Ezra and other lawgivers, nevertheless, those are just traditional attributions, and they are not, in fact, books are not, in fact, written by those people. So like I say, although the first 5 books, which we even call the 5 books of Moses, and I'll call here the Greek word for that, which is Pentateuch, or 5 books. It's also that's the same content of what the Torah is in Judaism. So if you say Torah, you're talking about the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. Like I say, traditionally ascribed to Moses, but the earliest components of those texts are centuries later than when Moses would have lived, if Moses were a historical figure. Scholars have argued that since the earliest prophets, so the people who we know as actual historical figures like Isaiah, since they don't quote the Genesis stories and haven't apparently heard of them, So they don't talk about Adam and Eve or the story of Adam and Eve or Noah or anything like that. A lot of scholars have assumed or asserted then that probably the reason why is because they didn't know those stories, and those stories were composed or written later than those prophets would have lived, and so forth. So let's look then real quickly at one of my very complicated charts, and we can kind of see the kind of time period leading up to the composition of the biblical narratives. And so you can kind of see whenever we're doing a countdown here in the before the Common Era or the BC era, the clock is ticking backwards, right? Because historians start at year 1 and go backwards for BC. And so anyway, if we go to the right side of this, 400, this is the time period when the exiles have returned. The Jewish exiles have returned from Babylon, rebuilt Jerusalem. They are led by figures including Ezra. And so in the 400s, Ezra, who is the leader of the exile community, reads from the Torah for the first time according to the book of Nehemiah. And a lot of scholars assume that this may be the moment when the Pentateuch as we now have it first exists. So at this point, all the sources have been edited together, either maybe by Ezra, maybe Ezra is the final redactor, or his scribes that he, as the senior official that's overseeing it, has pieced these all together to that point. So in terms of when anything else could have been written, we go back a little ways. You can see prior to this Persian period is the period of the Babylonian captivity. So that is between 587 with the fall of Jerusalem and the ending of the Iron Age, independent Iron Age kingdom of Judah, and 537 when Babylon is conquered by Persia and the exiles are allowed to return. So that's the time period when the nobles of Judah anyway are in Babylon. And so that's a period of kind of intense kind of composition as they're trying to decide what went wrong, how did God abandon us, why was God's temple destroyed, and so forth. And then the earliest components of the Bible then were probably composed, or a lot of the components, it depends. So a lot of times scholars will see the captivity and even the exile period as when much of the Bible is being written. Some scholars think it's earlier, and so that some of the flowering of Judah that takes place when between the time period when the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed by Assyria in 720 and the fall of Jerusalem in 587, during that time period, and especially at the end, under the king Josiah, that some of the texts were written, including maybe Deuteronomy and so forth. And then people like Isaiah extend back into the time period before Israel was destroyed. And so that's effectively the earliest parts of any of the Bible would have been written. And so you can see that's a long time ago. That's taking us back to, let's say, the 700s BC. And so that's comparable to when Homer or whoever, the oral poets that are constructing the Iliad and Odyssey and so forth are taking place as ancient Greece is emerging from the Dark Age. And so that's kind of the earliest texts of the Bible are kind of contemporaneous to that. And the Bible as it's, let's say, finally edited together, or the Pentateuch as it's edited together, takes place more at the end of that time period, 400, which is about when history is being created or invented by the ancient Greeks with Herodotus and Thucydides. But to get back earlier than that, we're getting away from when any written sources occur, and this is where we're starting to have stories that really aren't historical. So they're either they're mythical, or what is remembered, and so forth. And that includes the period of the united monarchy under David and Solomon. So David may well be the earliest historical figure in the Bible, but of that historical figure, as we mentioned a bunch of times, nothing essentially is known of him other than that he is the eponymous ancestor for the royal house of Jerusalem. All of the later stories about David are composed probably in the court of the Jerusalem kings, the kings who considered their ancestor to be David, and so they like hearing stories about their ancestor and so forth, and so that's where the David stories come from, again, many centuries afterwards, or actually in the exile and also the return periods even. And so everything that comes before that comes even before that. So as we kind of zoom back, so that takes us back, let's say, to a much broader timeline here now. That ending time period is all within the last 1,000 years BC, but if we're going to get all the way back to, let's say, Eden, that's going to take us to, let's say, 4,000-ish BC, and the flood maybe 2,500-ish BC, Abraham maybe 2,000 BC, Moses near maybe 1,400-ish, and so forth. So that's going to take that way past any kind of history that we have of the Israelites and so forth, and into and predating, in some cases, what we have for the rest of civilization, so ancient Egypt and also ancient Mesopotamia. And so Abraham, for example, would have lived, let's say, around the same time as the earliest components of the Epic of Gilgamesh are being composed and so forth. And so again, all of these are taking place way too long amount of time to separate between when they're actually written down as opposed to when they were occurring. And so the writers who are writing thousands of years later don't know really anything that occurred in this kind of time period. So the settings are imagined as opposed to historical. So the Pentateuch, or Torah in its present form, like I said, it's Greek for 5 books. Torah is Hebrew for the law. It also means instruction or teaching. These are the 5 books, as we kind of call them in English: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We use those names, and I say we, so I'm come at this from a Western English-speaking Christian perspective. And so we use those names because the Christian context is formed from the Greek version, the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible. And so those are all the Greek names, with the exception of Numbers, which we've translated into English. The Greek name for that would be arithmoi, so numbers. But they mean things like origin for Genesis, way out for Exodus, leaving Egypt. Leviticus, the book of the Levites, the priestly tribe of ancient Israel. And Deuteronomy means the second law, or the law as it is again. So it's kind of like we had the law in the first 4, and now this is a law again. And this is different from the Hebrew terms for the 5 books, which translate as in the beginning, names, and he called, in the desert, and words of, like words of Moses. So although these are divided into 5 books, which is to say a book is the length here of how long an ancient scroll could conveniently be, and so that's why they're relatively short. So scrolls are shorter than, generally speaking, are shorter than codices. The kind of scrolls that the Torah scroll, modern Torah scrolls, contain all of them now. So those are much bigger than the kind of littler scrolls that would have been, let's say, in the Library of Alexandria and so forth. So this is kind of a book-length scroll. Each one of these would be a book-length scroll. The first 4 of these are a continuous narrative, while Deuteronomy is sort of a retelling of the law, which is cast as a farewell speech that Moses is giving at the end of the 40 years in the wilderness journey that the children of Israel have as they've left Egypt. So if we kind of lay those out together into those one combined thing, like I say, the Pentateuch dates perhaps to Ezra, that Jewish leader in the post-exilic community under Persian. So he's a Jewish official of the Persian emperor who is running Jerusalem. We read in the book of Nehemiah, which is one of two scrolls of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. It describes Ezra reading the book of the law of Moses before the assembly of the people in Jerusalem, maybe around the year 444 BC, sometime in the 400s, let's say, BC. While he reads the book, all the people who are camped around, he builds a big wooden platform so he can read it. All the people who are listening discover instructions that they'd never heard before about how to celebrate a Jewish festival, the Feast of the Tabernacles or the Feast of the Booths and Sukkot, and they're supposed to do that. They find out they've never heard of that before because they have never read the Torah before, maybe because it hasn't existed in its present form before. And so they now are aware of that, and they start to observe Torah for the first time. And so here in this time period of Second Temple Judaism on Ezra, we start to have the origins, the earliest origins of the Jewish religion taking its form the way we kind of see it today, although it really only comes into the present, with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70s AD, and then the reform of the movement under the rabbis, Rabbinic Judaism in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, and so forth. Okay, so we take all of those scrolls laid end to end, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and it turns out that literary analysis, the academic discipline of literary criticism, which was largely developed in order to study the text of the Bible over the course of 2 centuries, has pretty well demonstrated that the Pentateuch is not the work of any single author, such as Moses. Indeed, one of the earliest literary scholars who studied this centuries ago pointed out, Moses actually dies in the Pentateuch, and the Pentateuch keeps going. So at some point or other, at the minimum, someone else had to write the rest of it, right, and take over for him. But in any event, it turns out that the whole is kind of a composite. And so scholars have identified a number of distinctive voices that are actually kind of divided up throughout the first 4 books. And again, like I say, Deuteronomy then consisting primarily of a separate voice altogether. And so for a whole long time, there was kind of an academic consensus about how this came to be this way, which is called the documentary hypothesis. That in the last generation or so has broken down, and there's multiple origin theories, but essentially the point is kind of the same. There are text blocks or voices that are distinct, that are divided up, and the question is kind of between the different hypotheses is how did that happen? How did we get to this situation of like intermingled voices like that? So the documentary hypothesis argues that the major voices here, which are called in that grouping J, E, P, and D usually, that those voices were originally separate texts that were edited together. Some of the new or alternate theories, and by the way, that's still a current theory, so lots of people still subscribe to the documentary hypothesis. But there are now alternate theories as well that argue instead, let's say, that these represent layers of expansion. And so essentially, it began with a J text, then somebody came along and decided to expand that, and that person that expanded it is this E writer, and then there was a text now that was a JE text, and then someone else got a hold of that, and they didn't particularly like it, and so they added lots more stuff, and that was the P writer, and then somebody added Deuteronomy. And so that would be another idea of a layers one as opposed to separate texts that are edited together and so forth. So when you're looking at this, even if you don't know Hebrew, you can, once you get the qualities of the different voices, they can be fairly distinct, especially, for example, the priestly voice. Once you kind of know the audible cues or the same kind of phrases or the interests of the priestly voice, it's especially identifiable. So the priestly writer is really concerned with priestly issues and is very interested, for example, in emphasizing the importance of Aaron. Aaron, who in the priestly source is the brother of Moses, who's the very first priest, and so forth. The priestly author has all kinds of things about rites and rituals. and they are all kind of focused on the priesthood in Jerusalem. The Aaronid priests, also called the Zadokites or Sadducee priests, people who are considered themselves to be descendants of Aaron. And so then the priestly author is also responsible for all of these really long, boring passages in Numbers and Leviticus and so on. And so if you've ever decided, hey, I'm going to read the Bible, and it's very easy to get through Genesis, which is a fun book, fun read, and you get halfway through Exodus, maybe to about chapter 25, and then it really starts to break down into all of this just long, things about how to make the Ark of the Covenant, how to do this and that, and all these kinds of things that are pretty long and dull. And that's when you're getting into the thick of the priestly author. So in the priestly text, if you separate out that, nobody, except until you get to Aaron, offers any sacrifice until you get to Aaron and then Aaron's descendants. And so, for example, we know the story at the end of Noah's Ark, where Noah sacrifices, gives thanks to God, that he and the world were spared, or a portion of the world is spared, and he offers a sacrifice, and there's a rainbow and everything like that. That story of a sacrifice like that does not take place in P, because nobody is authorized to offer a sacrifice except for Aaron and his descendants, and Noah is alive before Aaron. Likewise, that story of Abraham offering his son Isaac as a sacrifice, that again does not exist in the priestly story, because again, Abraham shouldn't be offering sacrifices because nobody's allowed to until you get to Aaron. Likewise, there's a big emphasis of Moses and Aaron in the priestly source always doing everything. And so in the priestly source, in the Exodus story, it's Aaron's staff that is performing all of the miracles and so forth, not Moses who's doing that. Likewise, if we know the story where Aaron is disgraced in Exodus, where Moses is up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments and so forth, and Aaron is forced by the people into, forgetting God, blasphemy, and creating an idol for them, a golden calf. That does not come from the priestly source. They do not like the idea that their ancestor is denigrated in that kind of way. Also, the priestly text is, let's say, more elevated, and it is much more concerned with, let's say, being serious. The kinds of things that we think of as religious nowadays, in terms of if we think of religion as being staid and boring, and you have to be dull to be reverent and so forth. That's the priestly author already has a handle on that all the way back in the biblical times here. And so, for example, things like talking animals, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, that's not a story that would be in the P source. And likewise, there is a prophet named Balaam whose donkey talks to him in the Pentateuch. And again, that is not something that would happen in the P source, because animals don't talk, and the P source is trying to make this a more serious book than that. There's also very distinctive terminology when you see the P source. So the P source uses the word assembly more than 100 times. No other voice actually uses that word. The P source uses the phrase gathered to his people as a euphemism for a death. No other voice uses that. The P source uses be fruitful and multiply 12 times, which is not found in any other sources. And the P source is the only voice that says that someone fell on his face, which it says 8 times. And so Numbers 20:16, I just kind of looked up one of these where the P source says this kind of thing. It says, "Then Moses and Aaron went away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces." That's the kind of thing that the P source, whenever you're hearing that kind of thing, that's really the P source, because it's always Moses and Aaron. They're talking to the whole assembly, the congregation of the people. They're always at the front of the tent of meeting as opposed to the tabernacle and so forth. They fall on their faces. These are kinds of things that are happening in the P text. By contrast, there's also distinctive terminology in all the sources, but for example, in the J source, which we're going to talk about here tonight, if you think of the word, like the phrase to know in the biblical sense, which is to say, as they knew one another and then they had a child. It's a euphemism for sex. That occurs 5 times in the Pentateuch, and again, it's always in the J sections. The J source also has 11 out of 13 instances of to lie with as a euphemism for sex. There's more sex in the J source than there is in the P source because the priestly guys, like I say, are trying to be much more elevated and boring. The term Sheol, for example, identifying the place of the dead, we sometimes would translate that as hell or something like that, but hell is a Scandinavian name for this. But anyway, Sheol, that occurs 6 times in J. That's not mentioned in the other voices. Also, the word to suffer occurs 7 times in the J section, not at all otherwise. And so lots of the languages and euphemism in J are also distinct the same way that P source is. The reason why the J source is called J by scholars is because the J source uses the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters that are God's name for God from the very beginning. So right at the beginning of the text, we see God called YHWH, Yahweh, as we sometimes say, or Jehovah. And so because the source was called the Yahwist or Jehovahist source, it's called the J source. So the other voices present the idea that God's name is unknown to anyone prior to its revelation to Moses before the burning bush. And so then, therefore, one of the other voices, the E source, is so named because it is using the word Elohim, which is the neutral term for God. That's always what the E source is calling God up until the moment when Moses asks, God, if I stand before Pharaoh and they say that I'm to let the people go, they're going to ask, what is his name? And God replies, I am that I am. This is the moment when God's name is revealed in the other sources. The J source is not aware of that detail, and so the J source is simply using God's name from the beginning, the J source being probably the oldest source. In addition, J presents a much more fleshy, human-like God. As I mentioned, he's like walking in the Garden of Eden, and he's also kind of physically shutting up Noah's Ark with his hand. He's breathing into the dust to form man from the earth. In other words, these are things that kind of a fleshy God is doing, as opposed to the very much more cosmic God as described in the elevated priestly source. Okay, and so won't spend a whole bunch of time going into this. There's another whole lecture on the documentary hypothesis, but the documentary hypothesis, therefore, is the earliest component text would be J and E. J probably representing the interests and ideas of the Judahite court, so the court of Jerusalem, whereas E, the Elohist source, because of its interest in heroes and so forth and places and so on of the northern kingdom. So the southern kingdom is Judah, the northern kingdom is Israel, the northern kingdom falls first. So it's probably stories of that are brought or added from the exile community from the north, and that's why their heroic deeds of their heroes are included. Those are combined together by an early editor creating a JE. The priestly author is maybe aware of the JE text but does not like it and has written a counter Torah to it, perhaps. But then at some point or other after the exile, perhaps by Ezra, J, E, and P are redacted together along with the Deuteronomy. And so possibly based on the JE source, there's simultaneously a Deuteronomic school, which is writing different layers of Deuteronomy. So there's an original version and then an edited fixed version of Deuteronomy. And then also that Deuteronomic history that shares kind of the same language and themes and values and so forth of Deuteronomy. And those are those books that we mentioned of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and so forth. Anyway, and so then those are all edited together, maybe at the time of Ezra, into the Pentateuch as we now have it. There's also, like I say, supplementary hypothesis to how this might have happened. So this would have given, instead of the different sources, different layers. So a first layer which is an original text. Somebody sees that, they decide to add to it a second layer. They take that combined text, somebody generations later sees that and decide, no, I want to add a whole, this isn't telling enough. We need to fix things. But instead of deleting, they mostly add. And so they add another section and so forth until all the layers come together eventually in the final edited version of the Pentateuch. However, whichever way these work, I think more or less, I think everybody agrees, as far as, since we're going to mostly be talking about J tonight, more or less people consider J to be either the earliest of the standalone text or maybe the earliest layer anyway. So essentially when we're looking at J, it almost doesn't really matter how the rest of the Torah is formed, because we kind of want to zero in on the earliest part anyway. So whether J was a distinct text that was combined with a distinct E, P, and D text, or whether J was simply the first layer of the text to which others are added, I think mostly people agree that J is among the earliest texts. Not everybody, there's certainly people think that some of the things that are assigned to J are later additions and so forth. But we're going to go ahead with the idea that J is coherent and early in this lecture. Because its focus is on the heroes and places in Judah, which is to say the southern kingdom that continued to exist after the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed, that kingdom in Judah as opposed to Israel, the text may have been composed there prior to the fall of Jerusalem. So, when I said before, I listed off all of these significant women that I kind of identified in Genesis and Exodus. If we now go back to those layers or those component texts and say, well, where are each of these from? Well, how many of these stories are from the priestly source and so forth? How many of these are from the J source? How many of these are from Deuteronomy? And it actually turns out that they're pretty much all from the J voice, although some of the characters, Sarah, Hagar, Rachel, Leah, they also overlap, and some of their stories are told or elaborated by the E source, which has some things in common. So whereas the priestly source and the Deuteronomists reflect sort of priestly themes and priestly interests, the E and J sources are both kind of more courtly and represent kind of non-priestly themes, as we'll see. So in other words, it's interesting here that there's enough of these figures that the whole Pentateuch actually has kind of a wealth of important and strong women characters. But actually, if our whole access to the Bible was J or just J and E, it would be much more dominated by strong female characters than all of these kind of expansions of having P and D add for us. So let's start at the beginning as we kind of look at all of this. So we have two creation stories, as lots and lots of people have observed right from the very beginning of studying the Bible, studying Genesis. Genesis 1:1 begins with the priestly creation story, and that goes from the first chapter of Genesis to the first couple verses of the second chapter. This is that famous, in the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And there's the 7-day period where the different components of the cosmos are created day after day. It's called days, but it's eras or whatever, symbolic eras, leading to the creation of humanity, where we have, in the image of God, male and female created he, them. So both men and women are created together, and both are created in God's image, God which transcends gender and so forth. By contrast, the second creation story that is from the J source begins a couple of verses into chapter 2 of Genesis. And in this story, man is created from dust by God breathing directly into the nostrils of the dust man. And then later, after man's been wandering around for a little while, God wants the man to have a companion, so he creates the woman from one of the man's ribs in the J story. So again, a very fleshy thing. So, like I say, Genesis 2 through 3.2, this gives us the story then of the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, which is likely drawn, like I say, from the J source, and it brings us our first patriarch and matriarch. Adam here is simply the Hebrew word for man, or even actually abstracted humankind or mankind. Eve, who initially in the story is called the woman, and is later named Eve, that name is from a Hebrew root that kind of is interpreted anyway as source of life or mother of all living. It's also related to the root for snake or serpent too, and so it's intertwined there in terms of how the story was created. The J author really likes puns and so forth. So the story is with the two of them. So let's go to Genesis 3 and read this. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor touch it, or you shall die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" The man said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." And God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" Then the man said, "The woman who you gave me to be with, the woman who gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate it." So just immediately tries to pass the buck here. He doesn't take any kind of responsibility. Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." So it immediately follows suit. She follows suit there. So God punishes the serpent by removing its legs. The woman is punished by making childbirth painful, and the man is punished by forcing him to do all of the difficult work of farming for food, which is essentially what humankind has had to do throughout all of history until very recently, when the majority of the population no longer work in agriculture for the very first time in the last couple hundred years. That was not true any time before in history. So all of these then, these explanations, these are what is sometimes called ideological myths. In other words, people wandered around in the ancient world and you wonder, why don't snakes have legs? Well, here is a story of why snakes don't have legs. Why is childbirth painful? This is a story that explains why childbirth is painful. Or why is life filled with difficult work? Why don't we just live in a paradise where you can just eat whatever you want off the trees and so forth? These are questions that people will have struggled with, and actually the questions will have come first, and then the stories actually come later. This is what we call ideological myths. In other words, a narrative that explains a question that you're faced with. So then God drives them out of Eden to prevent them from eating from the tree of life and living forever. And so that's the story from Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve. So if we think about it though, interestingly, Eve here in the story is really the active character, contrasted really with the essentially passive Adam. Eve is the one that's interacting with the serpent. She's the one that's eating the fruit, giving it to Adam. Adam just kind of passively accepts it. And really the only place where Adam initiates action is when he tries to excuse himself of wrongdoing by shifting blame to Eve, who, as I say, follows suit and blames the snake. And so, like I say, in this very first beginning story, the first matriarch is kind of portrayed as the stronger actor than her patriarch. If the story dates to J, the text then predates the addition of the idea of the devil to Judaism. So the story in general, whenever we talk about Adam and Eve, this labors, I think, under the weight of millennia of very heavy theological interpretation, and also a lot of theological interpretation that has been, I don't know, in a bad, gone in really bad directions and unfortunate directions. For example, directions that are very misogynistic. So, for example, there's a long history, Judaism, but especially in Christianity, of, let's say, blaming women for being the weaker sex, for falling prey to sin, bringing sin into the world, and so forth. And so that has been, I say, an unfortunate subsequent interpretation to a story that isn't existing initially in it. Likewise, even just the idea here, like I say, that the snake is Satan. That's already something, an idea that people have had in the Second Temple period of Judaism. It's an interpretation that exists at the time that Christians are writing the New Testament. It's a totally alien to the text. The snake in the original story is simply a talking animal, a common trope in fables. There is no cosmic idea of a cosmic devil or anything like that at this time in Judaism. This character does not appear. A cosmic devil doesn't appear in the rest of the Pentateuch at all. So right after the Adam and Eve story, for example, there is the story of the first murder, so Cain killing his brother Abel. It's not like this character of this devil that had been in the form of a serpent now appears to Cain, and that's what tempts Cain or anything like that. It's not something that happens. It doesn't exist. It doesn't in an idea that hasn't developed yet. It's probably something that is introduced into Judaism in that Persian period. Like I say, when the text is all being edited together, and later prophetic books, the later parts of Isaiah, books like Daniel, that's the very last Old Testament book to be written, those are being written when, well, the earliest, Daniel's written afterwards, but anyway, the earliest books that are being written when the Jewish exiles who've returned to Jerusalem are simply part of the Persian Empire. They have been influenced, they've been living in Babylon, they've been influenced by the Persian religion and Babylonian and Persian thought. The Persian religion of Zoroastrianism very much has a cosmic idea of a fight between cosmic good and cosmic evil. There is a cosmic God versus a kind of a cosmic devil, and this is where anyway, probably where the source of this idea comes from, as opposed to pre-Persian First Temple Judaism. I'm going to just also mention here briefly, this is an amazing, in my opinion, amazing Mormon painting of, I think it's in a Mormon temple, the original of Adam and Eve, very, let's say, white 1950s American Adam and Eve, wearing their garments after they're getting kicked out of Eden, the garments that God makes for them, and so forth when He's kicking them out. There is a lot of layers of retelling of the story also in Mormonism. In the Adam and Eve story, as it's retold in the Book of Mormon, Eve sort of becomes a heroine because, from the Mormon understanding, God has given Adam and Eve commandments that are contradictory. He's told them to be fruitful and multiply, the commandment that's coming from the P source, and He's telling them, don't eat of the tree or whatever, this a commandment that's coming from the J source. And so the Book of Mormon's interpretation is that these two commandments are at odds with each other, because until they eat from the tree, they're too innocent to have sex, and sex is a sin, and so forth. And so you have to have, Eve needs, in order to actually fulfill the plan of having a living earth with descendants and everything like that, Eve needs to eat the eat the apple, right? Or whatever it is, the fruit. So this idea of an inherent contradiction would not have existed for the original text of the J source, because again, that command to be fruitful and multiply doesn't exist for the J author. That's something that the priestly author is telling. And like I say, it's kind of a modern Mormon interpretation, that the idea that these were at odds, or that there was no sex or anything like that in Eden. That's an interpretation based probably on millennia of ideas where sex is viewed as being sinful, which again wouldn't necessarily be part of the First Temple Judaism's experience. So that's something that kind of gets layered on, especially because of Hellenism and Greek philosophy, which is anti-corporal, anti-physical, and often anti-sex or any other kinds of abuses or of the body, or not abuses, but even, let's say, pleasures of the body, or all those things which are, for the non-hedonistic philosophers, are to be eschewed. And so it's probably, anyway, as a result of all of that interpretation that gets us to that kind of a place. But it's an interesting reinterpretation, given that it's built on top of all of these thousands of years of layers of interpretation on this original story. Okay, so that's Eve. So I want to go through some of these other, I won't spend as much time anyway, going through some of these other interesting stories that are embedded within J narratives in Genesis and Exodus. So for example, the story of Sarah and Hagar from Genesis 16, we read there, now Sarai, which is the original name for Sarah, Abraham's original name, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave who was named Hagar, and Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she'd conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave to you for your embrace, and when she saw that she's conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." So although this initially seemed to Sarai to be a solution to the problem of Abraham and his posterity, once her slave is actually going to have the child, once she's pregnant, now she seems like she's elevated, because she is doing this thing for which ancient women, in order to have purpose and meaning, and in order to have their own posterity, they need to be able to produce children, they need to be able to produce an heir in a courtly narrative. And now this hasn't happened, and now she's upset with herself for having let it happen. But Abram says to Sarai, "Your slave is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and Hagar ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And the angel said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" And she said, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." So the angel talks to her for a while, and then he also says to her, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction." And so Ishmael means God hears. And so again, there's a pun always in this. So the Lord has heard your affliction, so name your kid Ishmael. And so Ishmael then goes on in the Bible to be the father of a group called the Ishmaelites, which is just a broad category name in the Old Testament for Bedouins. It's along with Amalekites and so forth. So in other words, it's people what we think of as kind of Arabs of the desert. And indeed, in Islam, Muslims consider Muhammad and the Arabs and so forth to be descendants of Ishmael. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi." So again, this is she's talking to God, and she hasn't heard God's name, but anyway, so she names him the God who sees, for she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? So Hagar bore Abram a son and named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And so, because, again, even though this is edited now, or the way the story is presented, that it's an angel of the Lord who's appearing to her, nevertheless, the thing that Hagar says is, have I seen God? So she talks pretty much about actually seeing God. And so maybe in the original of this, it's possible, again, that there is a direct connection that these early figures are having with God, because the original writer is not worried about the theological implications of that, but then it's edited down to being an angel in the later redaction, because the later editors do not believe that anybody is able to actually see or interact directly with God. But as we just look then in sum at this story of Sarai in Hagar, we kind of see, again, Sarai here is really the active partner in the story. She takes the initiative both in suggesting Hagar as a concubine and then getting mad about it and banishing her. Abram is pretty much just passive here. Cough for 1 second. Abram acquiesces to both of these things, and that he's going to have a concubine, and also without taking any responsibility. Your slaves in your power, do what you want, he says. It's not God that commands Abram to marry a concubine, but when Hagar is thrown out of Abram's household, God appears to Hagar and makes Hagar a prophet. God is, again, right with a woman here who is receiving direct revelation, and God actually gives Hagar the same promise that her descendants will be multiplied, the same promise that God gave to Abram. We also have the story of Sarah, where Sarai laughs at God. So God visits Abram and Sarah in the form, in the text if we have it, of 3 angels or 3 men. So Yahweh appeared to him, Abraham, at the oaks of Mamre as 3 men. And they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And Abram said, "Here in the tent." And God said, "I shall come back to you at the time of life, and here Sarah, your wife, will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance, which was behind him. And Abraham and Sarah were old, well in days, and Sarah had stopped having the way of women. And Sarah laughed inside her and said, "After I've withered, am I to have pleasure? And my Lord is shriveled." So Abraham is a shriveled old man. I am past the time of women, in other words, after menopause, and so forth. And Yahweh said to Abraham, "What is this?" Sarah laughed. "Is anything too wondrous for Yahweh?" And Sarah lied, saying, "I didn't laugh," because she was afraid. And God said, "No, but you did laugh." So here, Sarah again with Abraham, both are interacting directly with God, which is sometimes listed here as 3 angels, but it's sometimes just kind of God talking. And in any case, Sarah here actually laughs at God for this. We also have the story of Lot's wife and daughters in Genesis 19. So this is the story, the famous story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. When that's happening, they're given the instructions not to look back. Lot's wife famously looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. And so this again is one of these ideological myths. So why is there a Dead Sea? With this interesting landscape feature that is next to Judah and Jerusalem, this wasteland that's so much lower and salty and so forth, and what caused all these salt pillars to exist around there. And so again, the salt pillar is formed here in the ideological myth by Lot's wife, is being turned into a salt pillar, and same thing, the Dead Sea and all that wasteland is there because there used to be cities of the plain, and God destroyed them all, and that's again the myth of that story. In general, although this is misread about a story about sex, I think scholars are pretty well all agreed that this is a hospitality story. When you come into a place and you or offer. Part of the whole code of the Middle East is the hospitality code, and when you violate that, that's the worst thing possible. Obviously, there is a sexual component to this, but in fact, it's sexual abuse regardless of gender. So we'll read about it here in Genesis 19. So the angels who had visited Abraham and Sarah, they visit Sodom, and they're trying to sleep in the town square. But Lot convinces them to come and stay in his house. That night, when the townspeople surround the house, they cry out, "Where are the people who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us and let's know them." And Lot, and this is know again in the biblical sense, right? Let's know them. And Lot went out to the people and closed the door behind them and says, "Don't be bad, my brothers. Here, I have 2 daughters who haven't known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as is good in your eyes. Only don't do anything to these people, because that is why they came under the shadow of my roof." So, he's prepared to even sacrifice his daughters in this horrible way rather than the hospitality of guests who is offered. Interestingly, there is a doublet of this story. So this exact same story occurs in the book of Judges, chapter 19. In this case, it is a concubine of a Levite. So a Levite and his concubine are visiting the town of Gibeah, and they try to sleep in the town square. But an old man convinces them to come and stay in the house. That night, the townspeople come and surround the house. They cry out, "Bring out the man who came into your house, and let's know him." And the man who was the owner of the house went to them and say, "Don't, my brothers, don't be bad. Since this man came to my house, don't do this foolhardy thing. Here are my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out and degrade them and do what's good in your eyes." So it's, again, the fact that there's a doublet is showing that this is that there's an underlying story here, neither of which is historical. This is a talking about, again, kind of a propriety tale on what they're trying to say. So anyway, in any event, Lot's daughters ultimately in the J source get their revenge. So in Genesis 19, they say to each other, "Our father is old. There's no man in earth to come to us in the way of all earth. Come, let's make our father drink wine, and let's lie with him and make seed life from our father." And so this becomes then the origins of the neighboring peoples of Ammon and Moab according to the J source. And so essentially one of the things that the J source is doing is telling foundational myths or stories about both Judah, which is to say the court of the people where the story is being composed, and then all of their neighbors, both Moab and Ammon and Edom and Israel and the Ishmaelites and the Aramites and so forth. And so that comes from a kind of a family tree of Abraham, where, again, Abraham's brother Haran had a son named Lot, who by his daughters creates the Moabite, or the fathers, is the father of Moab and Ammon, the neighbors of the Israelites. Whereas Esau and the Edomites is the twin brother of Jacob and Israel and so forth, the tribes of Israel. Okay, we already talked about the story of Rebekah, so I don't need to repeat that. As we read, Isaac loved Esau, the father of the Edomites, because he put game meat in his mouth, but Rebekah loved Jacob, which is to say Israel. So as we saw, Rebekah is the actor in the story who sees to her favorite son's succession. Coming up, she is the one that comes up with the successful plan to trick Isaac, which involves Jacob actually lying and being deceitful. And Isaac is more or less shown as helpless to change the outcome and falls for the trick. We also have the story of Rachel and Leah in Genesis 28 through 30. I'm not going to go through this at length because we just did this a couple last month when we had our story of the lost tribes of Israel. But essentially, the competition that ensues between Jacob, who is also Israel. So Jacob has these 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. Rachel being his favorite, who is initially barren, Leah being the one he didn't want to marry, but is the one who is more fertile, and so forth. And as they're competing with each other, they also get their own handmaidens into the mix, just like Sarah had done with Hagar, and that creates then the story of the birth of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so, as we showed, the 12 sons that are eponymous ancestors for different groupings of people that existed at the time the story was being written. And so most of whom are tribes from the northern kingdom that have been destroyed, some of whom the exiles of which have come and are now in Judah after the destruction of the northern kingdom from the Assyrians. And as they are being part of the court in Jerusalem, they are trying to bring their, let's say, heritage and higher culture and civilization that they'd had up there is now being infused in and combined in Jerusalem through their stories, through the East stories especially. But in any event, that creates anyway the idea of the 12 tribes. And again, it creates this sort of these mythic eponymous ancestors and how they are made to be all part of a single family, all of the sons and grandsons of a guy named Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. So that kind of gets us through Eve and Sarah and Hagar, Lot's wife, Lot's daughters, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. We also have a few more stories that I want to touch on. For example, Jay's story of Dinah, who is the lone daughter of Israel mentioned in Genesis. So we read in Genesis 34, Dinah was the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, and she went out to visit the daughters of the region. When Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the region, saw her, he seized her and lay with her by force. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman, and he spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl to be my wife." So obviously he acted first, but now he wants to actually marry her. So Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with the cattle in the field, so he held his peace until they came. Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him just as the sons of Jacob came in from the field. And when they heard of it, the men were indignant and very angry because he had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. I'm glad that the Bible is coming down on that side. Yes, it ought not to be done to do that. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The heart of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall live with us, and the land shall be open to you. Live and trade in it, and get property in it." So there's an option here. Okay, this was a bad start. We didn't want to do this. We did something horrible, but just get over it. Let's make a marriage alliance, and we're going to join forces, and we'll all be one people, is the deal that Hamor the Hivite is making. And Shechem, his son, adds in for good measure, put the marriage present and gift, so whatever you want us to pay as a reverse dowry, as a marriage present, you give that as high as you like, and I will give whatever you ask me, only give me the young woman to be my wife. So the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. And they said to them, "Well, we can't do this thing that you're talking about. You want to make this big alliance with us, but we can't give our sister to a guy who's uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. So only on this condition will we consent to you, that you will become as we are, and that every man among you will be circumcised." And so they want to have, this ritual take place, which is important as part of the Abrahamic covenant and so forth, that Jacob and his sons have been following. And so the Hamor and Shechem, they say, it's kind of a crazy condition, but anyway, whatever, we'll go ahead and agree to that. And so they all agree to be circumcised. And then on the third day, when Hamor and Shechem and all of the men of their town and so forth are in pain, 2 of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords. They came against the city unawares, and they killed everybody in the city, all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword, and they took Dinah out of Shechem's house, and they went away. And then they plundered the city. They took everything, all of the animals and livestock and everything like that. And so then Jacob goes to Simeon and Levi and complains that they've just made everybody in the whole region, all the Canaanites, the Hivites, everybody are now super mad, and we're never going to have any peace and so forth. But their response to their dad was, well, should our sister be treated like a prostitute? And so this is how that peace didn't happen in this story. So while Dinah here is not given a strong or an active role, I think her story nevertheless shares some common themes with many of the other J narratives. So the J author, like I say, is telling origin myths about Judah's neighbors. So we saw that Ammon and Moab, the Ammonites and the Moabites, those are the children of Abraham's nephew Lot, but happening via incest. And so in other words, they are degraded or lower bumpkin neighbors to us, our Ammonite and Moabite cousins. Likewise, the Edomites, these guys who are the descendants of Jacob's twin brother Esau, who is a rube, who Jacob continuously tricks and so forth. Likewise, we saw how the Ishmaelites, the Bedouins, and so forth figure into the kind of the broader Abrahamic family. They're putting all of their neighbors that they are alike into this sort of mythic universe. And so here now, they also are associating the northern Israelite city. So again, like I say, the J source is here written in the Judahite, the southern realm probably. And so they are technically rivals with that northern kingdom. And indeed, certainly as a religious center, Jerusalem, which the different religious authorities are trying to, and the king are trying to get to be the center of the Yahwist religion and so forth, faces this very serious rivalry in northern religious centers like Bethel, like Samaria, and like Shechem. And so Shechem is one of the capitals of the northern kingdom. And here, pretty much what the J source is saying is, this great town Shechem is named for this Canaanite guy who raped a daughter of Israel. So in other words, they're really denigrating a northern relative here. And again, once again, in this case, the sons of Israel are portrayed as being kind of clever and mighty. So they trick these northerners here by, getting them circumcised, and while they're in pain, killing them all. Okay, so we got through all these to Dinah. I want to kind of quickly do Potiphar's wife, Pharaoh's daughter, and Sephora. So Potiphar's wife, a story of Joseph from Genesis 39. Joseph in Egypt. So Joseph is the favorite son of Jacob or Israel. Because of being hated by his brothers, he was sold into slavery, and he, from slavery, has advanced in ranks and has become the head servant in the household of Potiphar, who is one of the courtiers of Pharaoh, the chief of Pharaoh's guards. And so Joseph, it says in Genesis 39, had an attractive figure, and he was handsome. And it was after these things that the Lord of this household, in this case, the Lord Potiphar's wife, raised her eyes to Joseph and said, "Lie with me." And he refused. And it was when she spoke to Joseph day after day that he wouldn't listen to her, to lie by her, to be with her. And it was on a day like this, she caught him by the garment and said, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hands, and he fled outside. And it was when she saw that he'd left his garment in her hand that she called to the people of her house and said to them, seeing, "Look, he brought a Hebrew man to fool with us. He came to me to lie with me, and I called in a big voice. And she laid his garment by her until the Lord came to his house. And when the Lord, Potiphar, heard his wife's words, that his anger flared, and Joseph's lord Potiphar took him and put him in prison to a place where the king's prisoners were kept." And so here again, Potiphar's wife is the active agent in the story that's Joseph is more or less just trying to flee from. And this is a favorite kind of story of a false rape claim and so forth, which is problematic in its own way. So Pharaoh's daughter is another such figure from Exodus 2. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river. This is now centuries after Joseph, when the Hebrews have been living as slaves in Egypt. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw a basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. She said, "This must be one of the Hebrews' children." So she's aware that her father, the Pharaoh, has ordered that all of the male Hebrews should be put to death. This one has been put into a little basket on the river to save its life. So his older sister, Miriam, who had been following the baby, is right there, and she says to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And so that's kind of a knowing ask, and Pharaoh's daughter says to her, "Yes." So the little girl goes to the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to the mother of the child, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman, who's actually his mother anyway, took the child Moses and nursed Moses, and when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she named him Moses, which is a Hebrew pun for being drawn, because I drew him out of the water, she said. So again, Pharaoh's daughter here actively intervening against her dad's decree. What I'm going to kind of say here is that, once again, these are kind of courtly narratives. In this case, we're actually talking about directly a royal court. So Potiphar, as the chief of the Pharaoh's guard, and Pharaoh's daughter, princess here, are members of a royal court. So the story of an official's wife using her power to seduce her husband's beautiful servant, Joseph, has courtly themes, and this kind of story would be familiar and popular for a royal court audience. Likewise, Pharaoh's daughter circumvents her father's edict by saving Moses, a Hebrew baby, and then adopting him as her son. We also have here, not a courtly story, but one that I mentioned because I think of, I've always thought of this story as being one of the weirdest little components of the Bible, and so might as well mention it. So in Exodus 2-4, we have Moses' wife, Zipporah. So right after Moses has spoken to God in a burning bush and is returning to Egypt. So Moses didn't even want to go back to Egypt in any way to give God's message to Pharaoh, let the people go, and so forth. But even though he's now going to go do it, we have this very strange thing that God does on the way. So Moses took his wife, Zipporah, and his son, and he rode them on an ass, and he went back to the land of Egypt. And he was on his way at a lodging place, and God, Yahweh, met him, and he asked to kill him. And Zipporah took a flint and cut her son's foreskin and touched it to his face, and she said, "Because you're a bridegroom of blood to me." And God held back, and he held back from him. And then she said, "A bridegroom of blood for circumcision." And so this is a really weird story. But again, the wife here, Zipporah, is the one that's doing the action, right? So God is going to go kill Moses for some reason, presumably because Moses hasn't been fulfilling the covenant of circumcision. And so there's this kind of magic act, so where Zipporah circumcises Gershon, the son, and then uses the foreskin or whatever as a kind of a charm to ward off the spirit of, the killing spirit or whatever that's going to kill Moses or something like that. Again, one of the things about the Bible, because it's an ancient text, there are all sorts of nugget stories that are almost incomprehensible that are embedded into it that you would never write today because you don't think of God acting this way, and it seems completely crazy considering that's not what, God is actually trying to get Moses to go speak to Pharaoh and so forth. Okay, so that's we've gone all the way around. There's one more story here that I haven't done, which is Tamar, which is a story that we rarely hear about it, and I think maybe people might not even think the story of Tamar and even know what it is. So in Genesis 38, Tamar is one of the Bible's rarely retold stories. So Judah, it says in Genesis 38, saw a daughter of a Canaanite man, and he took her and came to her. So she bears Judah 3 sons in succession, who are named Onan, and Shelah. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was bad in Yahweh's eyes, and Yahweh killed him. And Judah said to Onan, "Come, your brother's wife, and couple as a brother-in-law. Come to your brother's wife and couple with her as a brother-in-law, and raise seed for your brother." And Onan then knew that the seed would not be his. So in other words, Tamar here is a widow of his brother, and his father's more or less saying, your brother's inheritance, like this child that you're going to have with her, will be essentially your brother's descendant, even though it's technically yours, right? In terms of genetics, they don't understand genetics. So Onan doesn't like that idea. And so when he came to his brother's wife, he spent on the ground his seed, so he would not give seed for his brother. And in doing so, he did what was bad in Yahweh's eyes, and God killed him too. And so this guy Onan gives us the name for onanism, which is masturbation. But what he's doing here is not masturbating. This is a withdrawal method or whatever, right? So in other words, the problem is he's not. They're not going to create children that way. So then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Look, live as a widow at your own father's house until my son Shelah grows up," because he said, "or else he too will die like his brothers." And so in other words, Judah's kind of saying to himself, wait a second here, this woman's cursed, and he doesn't want his last son to marry her the way they're supposed to in this kind of levirate marriage, because he doesn't want his young son to die. And so Tamar went and lived at her father's house, and the days were many, and Judah's wife died. And Judah was consoled. And he went up to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, to Timnah. And it was told to Tamar, saying, "Here, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." And so she took off her widowhood clothes from on her, and covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself up, and sat in a visible place that was on the road to Timnah, because she knew that Shelah, Judah's last son, had grown up, and she was not being given him as a wife. So in other words, she wants to have the birthright. She wants to be in the story. She is owed Judah's son in order to do it. Judah has decided he's not going to give his last son after 2 times, fool him twice in terms of letting his sons die, getting married to this woman. He's not going to marry his last son to her, even though he promised. Anyway, Judah saw her, Tamar, and thought her to be a prostitute because she'd covered her face. And he turned to her by the road, and he said, "Come on, let me come to you," because he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And so she said, "What will you give me when you come back to me?" And he said, "I'll have a goat kid sent from the flock." And she said, "If you'll give a pledge until you send it." And he said, "What is the pledge that I'll give you?" She said, "Your seal and cord for your staff that's in your hand." So he gave them to her, and he came to her, and she became pregnant by him. And she got up and went out and took off her veil from her and put back on her widowhood clothes. And Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to take back to the pledge from the woman's hand, and he did not find her. And he asked the people of this place, saying, "Where is the sacred prostitute? She was visibly by the road." And the people said, "There was no sacred prostitute here. What are you talking about?" So Judah wants to pay her, give the kid and so forth, the little goat or whatever, the little sheep, and as a payment, and get his seal back and everything like that. But no, the prostitute is nowhere to be found. It was about 3 months, and then it was told to Judah, saying, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has whored, and here, she's pregnant by her whoring as well." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." So she was brought out, and she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "I'm pregnant by the man to whom these belong." And she said, "Recognize to whom do these seal and cords and staff belong?" And Judah recognized and said, "She is more right than I am, because of the fact that I didn't give her my son Shelah." And he did not go on to know her again. So in other words, he doesn't end up killing her. She is able to get a hold of and bring herself into, again, the sacred lineage here of the story. Tamar ultimately gives birth to twins named Perez and Zerah, and these become eponymous ancestors of important clans or tribes within Judah, the Perizzites and the Zerahites and so forth. So there's another story of Tamar, or there's another Tamar in the book of Samuel, which is another one of the Bible's rarely told stories. In this case, it's a daughter of King David. This Tamar has a coat of many colors. So this is the only time that same kind of phrase is used in the Bible other than the coat that Joseph had. She ultimately is tricked and raped and cast aside by Amnon, her half-brother, kind of the leading princes of the kingdom, David's son. And then she's avenged by another prince, her brother Absalom, who kills Amnon during while they all go off on a shearing together. So in other words, this is another one of these kind of messy stories of courtly problematic things of rape and also killing and so forth, which the Bible is actually really full of. So in general, that's in the middle of a section of courtly narratives that occur after David has very long been king. So we have stories of David where he's the young shepherd boy and a hero and playing the Psalms, and then he's leader of a gang of bandits, sort of like Robin Hood. And then he's ultimately kind of a strong, great king, the king who assembles everything together in Israel. But then he spends his dotage as a long, weak king. And again, telling stories that are very interesting and negative, stories that are part of a kind of a courtly narrative. We're going to talk more about those kind of themes at a future lecture on March 14th, so I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail right now. But essentially, we'll have a lecture next month or month and a half, called Who Was King David? So let's sum up. The stories that we have in J are identity stories or myths. J here is among the earliest components of the Pentateuch. It's composed in the 600s or later. The text is thousands of years removed from Eden, which is, again, not a historical story. Eden is totally unknown to the other Israelite prophets. They do not talk about or quote Adam or Eve or anything like that. And also the story is written some 700 years after when Moses would have existed if Moses were a historical figure, which he's not. By creating identity stories about eponymous ancestors, the author of J crafts essentially myths about how the Judahites, the people in Judah, understand themselves in relationship to their neighbors. So why they are beloved of God, why they are attractive and clever and mighty warriors and so forth, and why the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites and even the people in the northern kingdom are never going to be quite as good, or in some cases are a lot worse than they are. And so, just as a recap, again, when we're getting to that, it's this later period when that is all written. Although the Pentateuch is important because it forms the foundation of the Abrahamic religions, the reason why I think it's readable and is still relatable is primarily because of the non-priestly components. So the J author that we've been going through in a lot of detail today, and also the E authors, tell these clever stories that are filled with intrigue and deceit and sex and murder, all of this kind of Game of Thrones style stuff. And common themes within them include power struggles among wives and concubines who are each competing to have their sons be the heir. This is something that would have been very understandable in the court of Judah, the court of Jerusalem, as the contemporary kings will have had a bunch of different wives and concubines, and there'll be plenty of different heirs, and whichever one is going to be the favorite, that wife is the most powerful, and so forth. So sort of ironically, from a religious standpoint, the components of the text that are written from a priestly perspective, so the priestly source and the Deuteronomist source, I would say they're generally dull, and there's some good stories and some great things from the priestly source especially, but they mostly govern, let's say, law and also, like, say, sacrificial rules, for a temple and priestly services that have been gone for 2,000 years, and so in most cases are totally irrelevant to anything, even in Judaism. So the law parts, much of the law parts is still relevant to rabbinic Judaism in its various forms today. Most of it, in terms of that stuff is actually all irrelevant to Christianity, although many Christians who don't understand that Christians do not adhere to Mosaic law, they like to quote little verses out of Leviticus completely incorrectly, as if they have some kind of a bearing or something like that on Christians today, which they clearly do not. But in any event, like I say, that wouldn't be read by pretty much anybody if it weren't for the courtly authors of J and E that tell all these really interesting stories. Just take an example out of the priestly narrative. So Exodus 25 is one of the places where the priestly source starts taking over. And this, if you might start reading the Bible, this is where you probably realize, this is going to get a lot more boring than I thought. And so it's once the priestly author takes over. So the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to take for me an offering from all whose hearts prompt them to give you shall receive the offering for me. This is the offering you shall receive from them: gold, silver, and bronze, blue and purple and crimson yarns and fine linen, goat's hairs tanned with ram skins, fine leather, acacia wood, oil for the lamps, spices for the anointing oil, and the fragrant incense, onyx stones and gems to be set in the ephod and for the breastplate. And they shall make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them in accordance with all that I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all its furniture, and you shall make it, and it's going to be this many cubits and so forth." And it just goes on and on about all of those kind of things, and it never stops. So we can be grateful then that we have J and E and not simply the priestly writers in the Bible. But that doesn't necessarily explain why there are so many strong women characters, especially in the J source. So the J source is filled, like I say, with courtly themes, and that may have been composed for an audience of courtiers around the time, let's say, of King Josiah of Judah. But is there an additional reason why there's so many strong women? So many scholars have kind of argued that the author of J was a woman, so perhaps a Judahite princess, so part of this royal family, and maybe that's the reason why the author here is so concerned with women being clever and doing providing so much of the action. Or it could well be that again, it's a male author or scribe that is being whose patron is a woman, or it's being written for an audience of both genders who are interested in these kinds of sophisticated stories. We can't ever say for sure, but for example, there's a very interesting book by Harold Bloom called The Book of J that takes what some scholars have kind of suggested as a woman as the author, as it's kind of a basis, and then he's kind of written a bunch of essays subsequently about that are kind of promoting this idea, and it's an interesting book. That's worth reading anyway. And so that is my take on matriarchs versus patriarchs in the Bible. Hope you found that interesting. I find some of these stories are not as well known as others, but others we don't maybe necessarily think of them in these terms. So I'm going to get a glass of water while Mike is giving me the different questions. So, Noah Henninger says, "Do you think there's any connection between Abraham and Sarah and the Hindu deities Brahma and Saraswati? If so, that would make them very ancient figures." So I don't know that there's, so maybe those names sound similar and there's similar overlap. I think the issue here is that Abraham. So I think Abraham has a word that is at its heart here, father, in that sense, and so like there is so it may well, rather than this representing very ancient figures where there's a combined thing. So for example, there is an underlying, let's say, relationship between the Roman god Jupiter and the Greek god Zeus. And so all of these words go back to, the Indo-European original of the name. So Jupiter is, Deus Pater, and Deus is the same word as Zeus. And so these are all going back to the sky god of the Anglo-Saxon root. And so that we can kind of trace. I don't know that that we have that for Abraham and Sarah, because we don't have, we don't have these underlying roots of where those have come from. So these names are less known to even to the ancient Israelite prophets than even Moses, which is a much more known figure. And so it's possible that these are actually a fairly late addition to the story that isn't being composed or doesn't have much of an antecedent prior to when the stories are composed by the J author. And so I've heard, like some of the study and speculation is that the origin of Abraham might have been based on sort of like property law, because some of the stories that are embedded, or the earliest stories, are Abraham establishing kind of property rights and so on, and so that maybe that's was where the name comes from, and then these stories are generated by the J author and the E author and so forth in order to create it. I would say that your theory here that there would be a connection to Brahma and Saraswati if we had a better example that Abraham and Sarah were originally Canaanite gods, and then they got converted or downgraded to humans in the rewriting in the J source or something like that. But I don't think that we can trace them that way at all. So I would say probably no is what I would say to that. So Bob Garrison asks, so very few books of the Bible were written by the authors they're credited to. Well, what do you say by very few? So a lot of the books actually are like the prophetic books, like Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel, and some of the minor prophets and so forth, will have had a historic guy named Isaiah who wrote some of that book. In general, the book as we have it, Isaiah, is not all of it written by that original historic Isaiah, but in that case, there would be a lot of books that are written by historical figures, especially the prophetic books. Books of those prophets. There are a bunch of prophetic books that aren't written by the authors they're credited to. So, for example, Jonah, that is a late story, and Job and Jonah and Daniel. These are late stories that are written by people who are not by those. They're fictional. So those guys didn't actually. Daniel, there might have been a historic person of which the book of Daniel didn't know anything about, and so essentially. Those are not written by the authors that they're credited to. But yeah, a lot of the other ones are not written by the authors they're credited to. Nathaniel Smith asks, why did Judaism switch from being patrilineal to matrilineal around the 1st century? So that, I guess I don't know offhand, in terms of how is that happening within Rabbinic Judaism and that kind of a switch. What I would say is that actually Judaism is just in general in a lot of flux at that time period, and so very little. We tend to think of the Jewish religion as being really ancient, and the Romans actually also thought of it as being ancient. By the time Jesus is running around, there is a sense that Judaism has been around for a whole long time. Certainly the biblical account makes it seem like that it's been functionally that way, or functionally like it was at the time of Jesus, people imagined, for thousands of years and something like that. In fact, actually almost everything that Jesus is encountering, this idea of keeping any kind of keeping kosher or observing the law as a large scale thing that is being done outside of just very isolated priestly communities, or just a handful of observances, that's something that's only been going on for a couple hundred years at most by the time of Jesus. So these texts have some more antiquity than that. Even when the earliest texts are being written, when the J source is being written at the end of the Iron Age kingdom of Judah, the religion of that time period, while we call it First Temple Judaism, it's effectively, the mainstream religion of the time period is effectively paganism that is no different from any of the paganisms of their neighbors and so forth. And so it is really, Judaism is really in flux. In, like you say, the 1st century BC is when the very first kind of serious observances are happening in the Hasmonean and Herodian kingdoms. And it's really then, like in the 1st century AD, and then in the 2nd and 3rd century, that the rabbis are creating their understanding, they're writing the additional texts and so forth, that's kind of creating the rabbinic Judaism that's the basis for modern Judaism. Stephanie Ceraci says, according to some archaeologists, David was a chieftain of a northern tribe, and Judea adopted Israel's history that Jerusalem was built by Canaanites. Do I agree with these archaeologists? So I have not heard this theory that David is a chieftain of a northern tribe. Definitely in terms of Jerusalem being built by Canaanites, that's even biblical, right? So in other words, the idea of it is that that even in the biblical description, Jerusalem is still a Canaanite city. So it's a Jebusite city, one of the Canaanite peoples, at the time of David, and David makes it his capital. So the original kingdom of Judah is centered on Hebron, which is a city to the south of Jerusalem. And the idea of it is, in establishing a new capital, David is supposedly connecting the northern tribes and Judah and making a central place. But to your point here, even though archaeologists have, I think, fairly clearly demonstrated that at the time when David would have been around, Jerusalem was just a completely insignificant little hill town. There is absolutely no way it can be the center of a large Iron Age empire like is described in the Bible. So David supposedly conquers Syria, and his kingdom extends from the Euphrates all the way to the river of Egypt, the borders with Egypt. That is not possible. And so that is, or at least it couldn't be centered on Jerusalem. So that is not a historical memory. That is a mythic period that the people writing after the destruction of the northern kingdom are re-remembering in order to exalt the ruling house of Jerusalem. The ruling house of Jerusalem being the kings of Judah. And so that's why, because David, who is David? David is just the eponymous name of the ruling house. So the people who are the kings of Jerusalem, they say, I am from the house of David. And so they assume that David must have been a historical figure, and that's where the name comes from. So there's no, we have ancient steles that are non-biblical that talk about leaders of the house of David. So we know that that's a historical name for the royal house. And some people have then asserted that that means that David is the first independently affirmed historical figure in the Bible. But all that affirms is that the royal house later understands itself to be named David. And then you assume that there was a guy named David. The same way that the original royal family of the Franks were called the Merovingians, and so they assumed that they must have had an ancestor named Merovich, who is their eponymous ancestor, but we don't really know anything about Merovich, and so most anything that have been said about Merovich is a later created legend, likewise with David. Mary in Poland says, I would like to know how the Catholic Orthodox cult of the Virgin Mary relates to matriarchy in the Bible. Well, I guess what I would say about that is there is a lot of problem, unfortunately, in Judeo-Christianity there's not a lot of space for the divine feminine. So throughout all of human history, there have been, men and women, and there have been male and female, let's say, spirituality. There were priestesses and priests, and so we just even read in the J source in the story of Tamar. Tamar is masquerading as a sacred prostitute, which are female or male in the Canaanite religion, and there are priestesses and priests. But when you get to the centralized religion of First Temple Judaism, and it's only the priests of Aaron, they're the only ones that are allowed to offer sacrifice, then they and that reform religion under King Hezekiah and under King Josiah, they stamp out female spirituality. So all of the attributes of the women gods of the Israelite pantheon that had existed before monotheism, Asherah and so forth, all of the attributes of Asherah, the queen of heaven, are subsumed into God and into Yahweh. So as I kind of said in the cosmic creation story of the priestly author, when God creates humans in God's image, male and female, God creates them. Female is also in the image of God, which transcends gender. God is not a man. God is beyond all of that in the cosmic understanding. But prior to that cosmic understanding, Yahweh was just a male sky god, and Yahweh's, the queen of heaven anyway, Asherah, was a female goddess or god that the Israelite women continued to worship through their own kind of spirituality that involved offerings of making cakes for the queen of heaven. And so, for example, even in that story of Abraham and Sarah, where God visits them, Sarah's off in her tent making cakes, because making cakes for the queen of heaven is one of the things that women did. And so Jeremiah, who's at the very end of the Judaic kingdom before Jerusalem is destroyed, he complains that women are still doing that. Well, they all kept doing that. In other words, there was never a time period in First Temple Judaism where that was beat out of people. So that was definitely part of, let's say, lay piety, female spirituality, as women were relating to God the Mother, God feminine, divine. And so unfortunately, in, let's say, Judaism, when we start saying God, He, and so forth, that tramples out a lot of the feminine divine. There's still room for it when we talk about, let's say, the wisdom of God, Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, and we talked about Hagia Sophia as a she because wisdom in Hebrew and Greek is a female gendered word. And so, in other words, we can still see it in the Bible, the feminine divine, but the priests are all male, the God is kind of male, the Jesus is male, and so on and so forth. So it does tamp down on and actually drive out a lot of the feminine divine. And so part of that not existing in kind of in market forces very well in Christianity is fixed in antiquity and the Middle Ages by the rise of Marian worship, or of reverence anyway, for the Virgin Mary, so the Mother of God. And so what I would say is that how much is it related to the matriarchy in the Bible? It's a omnipresent need, and because Judeo-Christianity is kind of theologically vacant of the feminine divine in unfortunate ways, Mary fulfilled that role, especially in Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Unfortunately, because of the Protestant Reformation, again, that's sterilized out of the movement for Protestants and so forth. And so we have to think of, let's say, other ways to get the he out of God. Leon writes us, he is now in Paraguay. Does John have any views about Melchizedek as a higher priest than the priestly caste of Aaron and his priests, as to why the Latter-day Saint Restoration leaders, Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith, created a higher priestly caste. And so I told, Leon is referencing, I told that story of a character, Melchizedek, that is in this very weird, isolated story in Genesis 14, where Abraham goes and has a kind of a conflict and a fight with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and Zeboam and so forth, and then he later pays tithes to the king of Salem, Melchizedek. So that is the only place where Melchizedek exists as a character, and it just means righteous king, so it isn't clear what that refers to. And it's associated with Salem, which means peace, and then that's sort of associated maybe with Jerusalem. So this is like the the idea of it is he's the ancient priest king of Salem, and so people have created additional ideas about what they think that is. And so people will say, well, Melchizedek is in fact, like the biblical Shem or somebody. And so people do the math and they realize all of those ancient guys are living hundreds and hundreds of years. And so Abraham is alive at the same time as Noah's son Shem. That is a modern reinterpretation of the story, as they're just trying to figure out why Abraham, this really important figure, is actually paying tithes or homage to another character that is otherwise not appearing in the Bible, Melchizedek. The only other place that the word Melchizedek occurs then in the Old Testament is in one of the Psalms, where the Psalm more or less says, "Thou art a priest after the order of Melchizedek." And it's probably referring there, and this is probably the source of this other story too, it's probably referring to kind of the cult practice in Jerusalem in the First Temple period, where the kings, when they are anointed to be kings by the Aaronid priests, they are set apart as priests and kings after the order of Melchizedek, of righteous kings. And so that's probably where it exists. How does that get to the Latter-day Saints? Well, in the Epistle of Hebrews, a New Testament text, the author of Hebrews says, we no longer need to have priests because Jesus is our one true eternal priest. We no longer have to have temple sacrifices anymore because Jesus is the one sacrifice for all times. So we no longer need to have priests after Aaron, which is to say the Sadducees, the high priests at the time of Jesus, nor do we need priests of Melchizedek because Jesus is the one true priest of the order of Melchizedek. So there hadn't probably been any Melchizedek priests at all by the time the author of Hebrews is writing. The author of Hebrews is aware of the Bible, the old Hebrew Bible, and has read maybe Genesis and especially the Psalms, and that's where that guy is drawing from to get that. And Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon read Hebrews, misunderstand it, and then restore orders of priesthood, Aaronic and Melchizedek, even though the whole point of that letter is we don't need those anymore, according to the Christian era. So it's a misinterpretation of the Bible. Wednesday Jones says, is the serpent a reference to another's faith story? So yeah, people have tried to dig into where does this come from. The part of the issue is so where does this happen? There are so there are religions that involve snakes. There's all kinds of potential pagan currents that come from this before this, and so I guess I would say it's speculative of where that would have come from. I think that there isn't necessarily a very clear answer where we're just saying, nod, nod, wink, wink. We know that this is a story where they're denigrating, let's say, the Philistines and their god Dagon or something like that. So I think it isn't. I don't think it's clear cut, but that's certainly one of the, as we're kind of looking for is there an undercurrent to this fable? People have speculated about different sources for where that might happen. Rain asks, were sacred prostitutes or temple prostitutes a common practice of the time? It reminds me of the Vestal Virgins. So the Vestal Virgins, kind of the opposite of sacred prostitutes in the sense that they're not having sex at all. But yeah, in other words, women priests in that case. So yes, sacred prostitutes or temple prostitutes is a very common practice of the time. It's not just for the Middle East, right? So for the Canaanite and Israelite religions, first temple period, and it would have been including the Jerusalem temple. So, so between the religious reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah, so the very end of the Judahite kingdom, there is the reign of a very long and most successful king of Judah, a guy named Manasseh. And Manasseh brings back, his father, I guess it was his father Hezekiah. Anyway, his predecessor Hezekiah had removed all of the idols, all of the statues of all the other gods from the Jerusalem temple. He'd kicked out all of the temple prostitutes and so forth. Manasseh brings it all back, including even the practice of infant sacrifice, human sacrifice, which is a common, again, Canaanite practice or Israelite practice. In other words, the practice of the people of Syria, Phoenicia, Israel, Canaan. They're all kind of one people there. And so that was a practice that Manasseh brought back, according to the Bible, it says. Talks about that. And so there were male and female temple prostitutes in the Jerusalem temple, just in the, in between, right in the couple hundred years before its destruction. And that had been the common practice that the reformers were trying to get rid of. So Darrell Scott says they were also trying to get rid of the human sacrifice. That's what the Abraham story with the sacrifice of Isaac is about. We're not supposed to sacrifice, even though God says, the firstborn of every womb is mine, says the Lord. We are no longer supposed to sacrifice our children anymore. That's why God brought a ram instead of that. Don't sacrifice your firstborn kids anymore. Same thing, the Passover. The original idea was you're supposed to sacrifice your firstborn child to God. Now what we're saying is no, put a ram's blood over your door and the destroying angel will pass it by, and you sacrifice a substitute of a goat or something. So that's a practice that they were trying to get rid of, what the reformers were trying to get rid of. Darrell Scott says, what caused the Judeo-Christian world seemingly to become more patriarchal later on? So Christianity is massively influenced by, not only, it merges out of Judaism, but then it immediately is massively influenced by the Greeks and by the Romans. The Greeks, while ancient Greek philosophers gave us all kinds of wonderful things, idea and the practices and so forth, ideas even from, the big origins of Western science and philosophy and democracy and all those kinds of things, they were terrible, notorious sexists. So women had no rights outside of the household. They were believed to be, very inferior beings by the philosophers like Aristotle and people like that. The Greeks were just amazingly patriarchal. The Romans had the same thing going on, not from an intellectual, philosophical bent, but from a legal bent. And so, God again is the Deus Pater, the Jupiter, and the head of the Roman household is the Pater Familias, and the head of the father has the right of life and death over everybody in the household. He can kill the wife for infidelity. He can kill son for impiety. Has the power over the slaves and so on in the household. It's just an amazing kind of, it would be bad form and people would look down on you for doing some of these things if you exercise these rights. But essentially, Roman society was very crazily patriarchal. And so even though, as we've talked about a bunch of times, there seems to be a very egalitarian bent among the Jesus movement, and that Jesus had disciples who are women who are equally placed essentially in the grouping as the male disciples, and have just as prominent roles. And likewise, people like Paul are saying, we're now all one in Christ. All of these distinctions don't exist. There's no longer slave or free, Greek or or Hebrew, male or female, we're all one in Christ Jesus. Nevertheless, there's also, which Paul also is guilty of, there's also emerging, rules that are restricting female piety and all those sorts of things. So the Judeo-Christian world ultimately succumbs to the surrounding, patriarchy of Greco-Roman culture, and also that is also where Christianity also gets its taboos about sex and things like that. It is really something that it is adopting out of the Judeo-Christian world. This kind of era of paganism, people think of paganism as just being a sexual free-for-all and frenzy. It's pagan philosophers that are eschewing physicality as being bad, and those are the ideas that are trickling in and are being promulgated by people like Paul. Run and Shoot asks, is there a presentation on Marcion of Sinope or the idea of the Evangelon of Marcion as a proto-Luke in the queue of upcoming lectures? There is not a current lecture on Marcion. We have had a lecture on lost Christianities where we talked about the Marcionites, in a lot of detail. We talked about essentially the earliest, Jesus people and the poor of Jerusalem, the Jewish Christians. We talked about Paul and the kind of proto-Orthodox group. We talked about Marcion and that new layer, and we talked about the Gnostics and so forth. But I haven't done one where we focus entirely on Marcion yet. But that's an interesting idea. I mean, it may well be. It's worth a focus on. So I'll definitely have it in my head. Thanks. Alexander Santos Anderson says, is there a reason later texts such as Ruth and Esther and Judith and Jubilees and the New Testament feature women more prominently and give names unlike unnamed women like Noah's wife versus older works? So yeah, I think it depends on the author in each one of these cases. So one of the things that we have to understand in the Bible or anything else, that the text is written by multiple diverse people over the course of centuries who have very different perspectives and values and so forth. One of the things, in some of those cases, people have posited that women are more prominent, like in the J source or the Luke, that because maybe there's a woman author that's involved or something like that. It can't be shown for anything in particular for sure, but there were some women who were actually authors and or who are, let's say, patrons whose values are recognized, and there's also some male authors who are interested in women and who are writing about women. One of the examples that I kind of have is, in the case of the Book of Mormon, for example, this is a text that's entirely composed by Joseph Smith, and there are effectively no women characters in it. He's got the main character, who's the Joseph Smith stand-in, Nephi, has his mother as one of the main characters, and then there is essentially one of the kings has a mother, wife, and then there's one prostitute, and there's pretty much no other, maybe 2 or 3 named women in the whole course of the text. There's no important women characters effectively in the Book of Mormon because, again, it's by one guy who wasn't thinking about, he's recently married and he's not thinking about women's stories or women's narratives, at least at the time he's composing that particular text. If he was writing it a little bit later, I think it would have been different. But that's just where he was at the time. And another distinctive or idiosyncrasy of that particular author is that he also, when he's using adjectives, for example, he doesn't ever say what color anything is. And that's just an idiosyncrasy of the author. So why would some of these texts, like Ruth, for example, so prominently be a woman's narrative? Ruth is an amazing book, one of my favorite books of the Bible, and maybe Ruth is being written at the time period of Ezra, where Ezra is demanding that the Israelites that are loyal to him in the Persian province of Yehud around Jerusalem, that they have to cast off their foreign wives. So they've married, they're intermarried with Moabites, and Ezra says, in order to be pure, you need to divorce your wives and disown your children and so forth. And the author of this text is probably either intermarried with or is very antagonistic to that view, and has told a strong rebuke to that in the form of the Ruth story. And so I just would say sometimes the characters are thought out and are named, and other times, like you say, as you point out, Noah's wife isn't given a name, and so forth. So to close, I want to recognize our live audience who've joined us from all around the world today. So outside here in Canada and also the US, we've had check-ins from Scotland, Guatemala, Colombia, Italy, Paraguay, Poland, Portugal. It's really amazing how this has all worked out. We thank you so much for being part of this community, for enjoying and being part of the discussion. This has been a great discussion. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Like I say, if you'd like to support us, you can always do so at our website, centerplace.ca/donate. Thanks so much.